I've been opening MrBeast Lab Swarms test tubes every day for 100 days looking for the incredibly rare Hyperchrome Panther. And today I'm going to open this entire case of Lab Swarms test tubes. This case has 12 test tubes, so let's pick up our first one and add some water. Now that we added water to our first test tube, let's give it a good mix. That should be good enough, so now let's release the blue slime. Now I'll go clean off the swarms and see who we got. In our first test tube, we got Terrapin, who's a common, and Lodi, who's a rare. Now let's grab our second test tube and add some water. Let's give our second test tube a mix. Should be good, so let's release the blue slime. Alrighty, now let's go clean them off. In our second test tube, we got Boom Boom, who's a common, and Putrid Pest, who's a rare. Now let's move on to our third test tube. Let's give our third test tube a mix. Now let's release the slime. Whoops, we got a big explosion there. Looks like we got a panther, but I'll clean them off and see who we got. In our third test tube, we got Raging Rat, who's a common, and the Fiery Panther, who's a MrBeast Squad Ultra Rare, and he's one of my favorites. So let's set him aside and move on to our fourth test tube. Now let's mix up our fourth test tube. Now I'll go clean them off. In our fourth test tube, we got Fury Flush, who's a common, and Howl Scowl, who's a rare. So we're 1/3 of the way done, but let's move on to the second row and open up our fifth test tube. We have our fifth test tube, and it's already starting to leak over, and I'm afraid I added too much water, but let's give it a mix. Now let's open it up. Uh-oh, the blue slime. I guess I didn't stir it up enough. It's like a sludge right now. Let's clean them off and see who we get. For the fifth test tube, we got our first Tethermite, who's a common, and Stone Bones, who's a rare translucent. Now let's go on to the sixth test tube. Maybe I didn't add water or mix it up enough, but we got another big batch of slime. Looks like we got the Midnight Panther, so let's clean them off and see who we got. In our sixth test tube, we got Recliner, who's a common, and the Midnight Panther, who's a MrBeast Squad Ultra Rare Translucent. Now let's move on to the second half of our case. Hopefully our luck will change in the second half of this box and we'll get some new swarms. So now let's mix up the seventh test tube. Now let's release the blue slime. In our seventh test tube, we got Grizzly Grouch, who's a common, and Snarling Speaker, who's a MrBeast Squad Rare. Now let's move on to our eighth test tube. Now let's release the blue slime. For the 8th test tube, we got Fang Vision, who's a common, and Button Brawler, who's a MrBeast Squad rare. Now let's move on to the final third of the box. Our 9th test tube is already dripping and leaking water and making some hissing sounds, but let's mix it up anyway. Not sure if this is mixed up enough, but let's let it out and see. Maybe I didn't. Well, I'll try and clean them off and see who we got. In this test tube, we got Ray Traddler, who's a MrBeast Squad common, and the Toxic Panther, who's a glow-in-the-dark MrBeast Squad ultra rare. Now let's move on to our next test tube. Hopefully we'll get lucky in one of these final 3 test tubes. Now let's release the blue slime. That one was kind of hard to open. Let's go see who we got. In our 10th test tube, we got Warped Scorp, who's a common, and Tube Dude, who's another common. Now let's move on to our next 2 test tubes. Down to the last 2 test tubes, so let's add water and see who we get. Let's mix it up. Now let's release the slime. In our second to last test tube, we got Lampy, who's a common, and Mega Mauler, who's a rare. Now let's move on to our final test tube. It's not looking good, but hopefully we'll find something new in this final test tube. Let's go add some water. Let's give our final test tube a good mix. Now for the last time, let's release the blue slime. Now let's clean them off and see who we got. In our final test tube, we got Freak Historic, who's a common, and Fleshinator, who's a MrBeast Squad rare. After opening up our entire case of test tubes, here's all the swarms we got. We have our ultra rares here, our rares in the second row, and our common swarms in the back. Unfortunately, out of all 24 swarms, every single one was a duplicate. Thank you so much for supporting me over the past 100 days, and I'll see you tomorrow.